Now that you have an advanced understanding of acute muscular fatigue, you should have a good understanding of its implications to human performance. To reiterate, acute muscular fatigue is the most limiting factor to performance or general physical functioning. For example, if you experience acute muscular fatigue at relatively low workloads, like say walking 2 miles per hour down the street, this could certainly affect one's overall function and quality of daily living. The implications of acute muscular fatigue are obviously much clearer in sporting situations. The athlete who is able to do more work with less fatigue is usually the athlete that performs the best. You can be the fastest sprinter or highest jumper, but acute muscular fatigue will negate these abilities. These are the reasons why acute muscular fatigue is an important target of intervention for exercise training programs. Specific training programs that are intended to improve the level of muscular work with less acute fatigue are referred to simply as conditioning or endurance training. Some other terms that have been used to describe this type of training is metabolic training. So any of those terms are really referring to the same type of training. Training that is intended to improve your ability to perform at greater workloads without or with less acute muscular fatigue. So in part 2 of this lecture series, we will take concepts from part 1 regarding the science of acute muscular fatigue and the variables involved, such as anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity, and apply it to training. In other words, we will answer the question of how we can improve the level of muscular work with less fatigue and what are the underlying mechanisms. We will also highlight the fundamental factor underlying training adaptations, meaning what is required to stimulate changes in the muscle as well as the body in general for you to be able to eventually do more muscular work with less or no fatigue. So first, as always, let's go ahead and make sure we are clear on some key terminologies. So as I said earlier, conditioning, aka endurance training, aka metabolic training, is a long-term exercise training program that is specifically designed to improve muscular endurance. So what is muscular endurance? Well, many believe muscular endurance is simply how long we can exercise for, or how long or far we can run, for example. This is not muscular endurance. Muscular endurance is not about simply how far you can run, for example. It's about the running speed or muscular work you can achieve and sustain. The operative word there being sustain. Let's put this into a race perspective. Is performance in a race about how far you can run, or is it about how much speed you can produce and sustain without fatigue? The latter is what determines performance, and the latter concept is what is most practically significant. There's very little practical incidences where one is required to simply do some level of muscular work for as long as possible. What's more practically relevant is the ability to sustain greater muscular work, like running faster for a longer period. That is muscular endurance. So what is the limiting factor for you to be able to sustain as much muscular work as possible? That limiting factor is acute muscular fatigue. Acute muscular fatigue, as detailed in part 1, is going to be what determines the amount of muscular work one can achieve and sustain. Sustain is again the important term here. So for instance, say you had 2 athletes running the 800 meter, and you instructed them to achieve a workload of 12 miles per hour. One athlete is able to achieve a 12 mile per hour running speed and sustain it for a majority of the 800 meter run. The other athlete is able to achieve 12 mile per hour running speeds, but can only sustain it for, say, 200 meters due to acute muscular fatigue. Who will win the race? Who performed better? The first athlete, right? The first athlete has greater muscular endurance. That first athlete was able to produce a workload of 12 miles per hour in running speed and sustain it for the majority of the 800 meter run, while the other athlete was only able to achieve that same workload for only 200 meters because of acute muscular fatigue, muscle inhibition in response to a stressor. And so because muscular endurance is predicated on the ability to achieve and sustain greater muscular work because of less fatigue, muscular endurance can be simply described as fatigue resistance, in that the greater the muscular endurance, the greater resistance to fatigue. So to reiterate, fatigue resistance and thus muscular endurance is the ability to achieve and sustain greater muscular work. And this is both continuously, like during a race, or intermittently, like during a soccer match or basketball game. Now, as it relates to sporting scenarios, here are some examples of what it means to improve muscular endurance and thus fatigue resistance. Being able to run at a faster pace during a race. Being able to hike at a faster pace and finishing the trail earlier. Being able to move faster throughout a soccer match and not be overly limited by fatigue. Completing high loads with greater volume during a CrossFit workout of the day. So before delving into the science of conditioning, let's recap the mechanisms underlying acute muscular fatigue. By now, you should be familiar with this figure and what it represents. This figure displays the integration of aerobic and anaerobic metabolism in meeting the rate of ATP demand during exercise from light to maximum intensity exercise. Now, we can categorize exercise workloads based on whether they are pre-anaerobic threshold or post-anaerobic threshold. Pre-anaerobic threshold exercise workloads are workloads in which the rate of ATP demand can be adequately fulfilled aerobically because there is adequate oxygen delivery and availability for that to occur. Post-anaerobic threshold exercise workloads are workloads in which the rate of ATP demand cannot be adequately or fully satisfied aerobically because the oxygen required to do so is not sufficiently available, and thus a non-oxygen requiring ATP producing system called the anaerobic system works to fulfill only the portion of the ATP demand that the aerobic system cannot. And remember, this portion we refer to as the energy void. So with that said, we can clearly see that the anaerobic systems are never the sole contributor to the ATP needs. The aerobic system never shuts off. It is always contributing to the ATP needs, and its activity increases with increasing intensity and ATP demand. So the anaerobic threshold, as indicated here, is simply the exercise workload or intensity at which the aerobic system cannot fully meet the ATP demand of the active muscles, and anaerobic systems kick in to help out. As the workload increases further past the anaerobic threshold intensity, the aerobic ATP production continues to rise, but there is a greater reliance on your anaerobic systems to help meet the rising ATP needs. The aerobic capacity, as indicated here, is the ATP producing capacity of the aerobic system, meaning it describes the maximum capability of the aerobic system. And as I mentioned in part 1, the variable that is used to quantify or measure aerobic capacity is maximum oxygen consumption rate, or VO2 max. And this should make sense to you all by now, since we know that the ability for the aerobic system to produce ATP is completely dependent on the rate oxygen is consumed and available. So the maximum oxygen consumption rate accordingly reflects one's aerobic capacity. I will reiterate this later on. So let's go ahead and continue this refresher and discuss acute muscular fatigue in relation to this figure here. First, acute muscular fatigue occurs within this zone of workloads or intensity, again described as post-anaerobic threshold workloads or intensity. Oftentimes, the post-anaerobic threshold workload is described as quote-unquote anaerobic exercise. But as you can see, this is a misnomer, since during post-anaerobic threshold workloads, the aerobic system is still the primary ATP producing system, and the anaerobic system is simply filling a portion of the ATP needs that the aerobic system cannot. It is simply a backup support system. So I don't like to describe exercise as either aerobic or anaerobic. Exercise, no matter whether you are walking or sprinting with all-out effort, is always aerobic. So because the term anaerobic exercise is inaccurate, I like to use the term post-anaerobic threshold exercise or pre-anaerobic threshold exercise. So post-anaerobic threshold intensities or workloads are fatiguing and can be sustained only for a brief period of time. Why? Because of acute muscular fatigue, which again is the involuntary inhibition of muscle contractions in response to a hypoxic stress. And as we discussed in part 1, that hypoxic stress results in acute metabolic acidosis and, of course, the inorganic phosphate accumulation, which disrupts the process of muscle contractions. Remember, fatigue is simply a negative feedback system that forces your muscles from being in a post-anaerobic threshold hypoxic state to a pre-anaerobic threshold non-hypoxic state. Essentially, fatigue forces your muscles to demand less ATP and thus less oxygen by quote-unquote slowing it down, by pumping its own brakes. So fatigue is simply an acute or immediate stress relief system. That stress, again, being hypoxia, which is what characterizes the post-anaerobic threshold condition. So post-anaerobic threshold exercise and hypoxia are synonymous. So remember, post-anaerobic threshold is characterized by the oxygen consumption and availability not being able to meet the oxygen required for the aerobic system to fully meet the ATP demand. This is a hypoxic situation. All right, so once your workload or intensity exceeds the anaerobic threshold, fatigue starts to set in because there is the presence of hypoxia in the active muscle cells. Now, as you increase the workload or intensity further past the anaerobic threshold and towards maximum intensity, the hypoxia becomes more and more severe, and thus the fatigue becomes more and more severe, and thus the exercise workload or intensity becomes more and more difficult to sustain. And we know this because we generally understand that an all-out sprinting speed is less sustainable because it is much more fatiguing than running slightly slower. Finally, let's focus on the third box in the bottom right-hand corner, which will segue into our discussion on the science of conditioning. Now, let's think about the fundamentals of training adaptations. Let's say that a workload of a 10 mile per hour running speed is a post-anaerobic threshold workload and can be placed, say, like right here on this curve. It's not maximum intensity, but it is post-anaerobic threshold, and therefore it is fatiguing because there's obviously a hypoxic stress in the muscles. So what needs to happen in order for you to be able to exercise at this 10 mile per hour workload without fatigue? Obviously, you need to train, but what needs to happen physiologically? Well, if hypoxia is what's causing the fatigue at this 10 mile per hour workload, changes need to occur so that the 10 mile per hour workload goes from being a post-anaerobic threshold hypoxic workload to a pre-anaerobic threshold non-hypoxic workload. So in reference to this figure, what needs to change? The white area under the curve needs to increase. More specifically, the anaerobic threshold point needs to shift to at least a 10 mile per hour workload so that the 10 mile per hour workload is non-hypoxic and non-fatiguing. Now in the next slide, we will discuss this further, but for now, we have to understand that the fundamental aspect of training is that adaptations in the body or parts of the body like muscle occurs in response to a constant or frequent stressor. If there is no stressor present, there is no adaptation and therefore no positive changes. So training without sufficient stress is not training at all, since no changes will occur. There will be no reason for the body to undergo adaptations and changes because there will be nothing to adapt to. When there is a constant, frequent stressor, the body or parts of the body that are undergoing that stress will adapt to the stress, so the stress becomes no longer stressful eventually. In so doing, the body or parts of the body that has undergone adaptation is quote-unquote enhanced. So adaptation can be viewed as the long-term stress relief system. So in order to reduce the stress of this 10 mile per hour run and thus the fatigue associated with the 10 mile per hour run, what should be the fundamental basis for the training program? The training program should frequently impose a hypoxic stress to the muscle. So when this hypoxic or metabolic stressor is imposed on the muscle consistently, the muscle will eventually adapt to it. This is a form of a survival mechanism. The muscle recognizes that this hypoxic stress is frequent and is a threat to the muscle. So it undergoes processes to adapt to the stress, thereby making it more, quote-unquote, enhanced. It will adapt to the frequent hypoxic stress, so eventually that 10 mile per hour workload is no longer associated with the hypoxic stress. You have undergone adaptations to the hypoxic stress associated with that 10 mile per hour run, and thus enhancements, so that the 10-mile-per-hour workload is quote-unquote easier, and you are able to sustain it because there is no hypoxia to induce fatigue. What this means is that training should be at or above the anaerobic threshold in order to impose appropriate metabolic/hypoxic stress on the muscles so that the muscles have a reason to adapt and to move this white curve and thus the anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity upwards. So let's take a look at how these curves change over time with training in that post-anaerobic threshold zone and what type of adaptations are taking place. So as you engage in a conditioning program consisting of repeated bouts of post-anaerobic threshold exercise and your muscles undergo frequent hypoxic stress, adaptations to this stress will occur. So what type of adaptations will take place in response to this frequent stressor? The adaptations that take place in response to post-anaerobic threshold type training are aerobic adaptations, not anaerobic adaptations, because that would make no sense, as you all should know by now. There is only aerobic fitness. There's no such thing as anaerobic fitness. You are trying to become less reliant on anaerobic systems at higher workloads, and you want the aerobic systems to become more reliable, or in other words, more quote-unquote powerful, to better meet the ATP needs of higher workloads. In summary, the result of training will be reflected by the changes you see here in this upper right figure compared to this baseline figure. So this is pre-training and this is post-training. As you can see, the white area under the curve, which represents aerobic ATP production, is much larger compared to baseline. You see two variables of aerobic ATP production improving with training. You see an improvement in anaerobic threshold as well as aerobic capacity. Now let me put this into the context of that 10-mile-per-hour workload example. Say at pre-training, that 10-mile-per-hour workload was a post-anaerobic threshold workload and can be placed right about here on this curve. At pre-training, that 10-mile-per-hour workload induced a hypoxic stress to the muscle and fatigue occurred. You were not able to sustain that 10-mile-per-hour run for very long. Now with training, you experience these changes reflected by the figure here on the right, where the anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity increases. And that 10-mile-per-hour workload is placed on the same area of this curve as it was on the other curve for the baseline. You see now, because the aerobic system has improved, the 10-mile-per-hour workload is now a pre-anaerobic threshold workload. This means there is no more hypoxic stress and no more fatigue. This means that you are now able to sustain a 10-mile-per-hour workload without fatigue. So in summary, the improvement of muscular endurance and thus fatigue resistance as defined earlier is a result of aerobic adaptations, which is reflected by two measures: improved aerobic capacity and improved anaerobic threshold. An improvement in aerobic capacity, as you see here, can be quantified by an improvement of VO2 max. Again, maximum oxygen consumption rate. This means that if you experience an increase in VO2 max during a VO2 max test taken before and after months of training, that would reflect an improvement in aerobic capacity. Next, an improvement in anaerobic threshold can be quantified by an improvement in lactate or ventilatory threshold. Remember, the anaerobic threshold is when lactate production increases due to increased fast glycolysis, and ventilation rate increases due to metabolic acidosis. The lactate threshold is the workload or intensity where lactate levels in the blood increase exponentially, and ventilatory threshold is the workload or intensity where ventilation rate increases exponentially. These are reflective of the anaerobic threshold and can be measured to quantify the anaerobic threshold. So say if your lactate or ventilatory threshold occurred at 7 miles per hour pre-training, and after months of training, your lactate or ventilatory threshold now occurs at 11 miles per hour, that means aerobic adaptations have occurred. That means your anaerobic threshold has improved. So altogether, an improvement in aerobic capacity and anaerobic threshold are what results from the aerobic adaptations to post-anaerobic threshold training or conditioning. Now, as a side note, improving anaerobic threshold is more significant for well-trained individuals, as well-trained individuals do not experience significant improvements in aerobic capacity or VO2 max because they have likely already achieved the highest potential aerobic capacity possible. So usually well-trained individuals focus more on anaerobic threshold and get tested for lactate or ventilatory thresholds as opposed to VO2 max. Now, collectively, the anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity is referred to as aerobic power. So the factors constituting aerobic power are anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity. So the goal of conditioning programs is to improve aerobic power, which can be simply described also as an improvement in aerobic fitness. So if I ask the question, an improvement in aerobic power following training is reflected by which of the following? It would be an improvement in anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity, the two factors that constitute aerobic power. Now, other potential answer choices could be an improvement in VO2 max and lactate or ventilatory threshold, which I said were measures of aerobic capacity and anaerobic threshold, respectively. Now, later on in this lecture series, we will discuss what these aerobic adaptations are that contribute to this increase in aerobic power. I'm sure you can already guess that the adaptations involve greater oxygen supply and improved mitochondrial power or function. So more on this later. For now, just understand that the aerobic adaptations that improve aerobic power are multifactorial and involves multiple organ systems, meaning it's not just about changes in the muscle, but in other organ systems as well. So what about the other side of the coin? What happens when you get out of shape, when you detrain or become sedentary? The figure here down to the left represents those changes compared to baseline. As you can see, aerobic power decreases, and that would be reflected by a decrease in anaerobic threshold as well as aerobic power. So let's again use that 10 mile per hour workload again. So let's say at baseline, a 10 mile per hour running workload was placed right here on this curve, right above the anaerobic threshold. And therefore, the 10 mile per hour run was slightly fatiguing. But you decided to just become completely sedentary. Now, because there's absolutely no metabolic hypoxic stressor imposed on the muscle may undergo de-adaptation, which again is reflected by a decrease in aerobic power. So now let's place that 10 mile per hour workload on the same area on this curve. You just put it down here. Now you can see that because the aerobic power decreased, that 10 mile per hour run is now way above the anaerobic threshold and is even more fatiguing because there is more hypoxic stress. In simple terms, you have become out of shape. You become less aerobically fit. Okay, so in summary, training with post-anaerobic threshold intensities and frequently imposing that hypoxic stress to the muscle will result in aerobic adaptations, which will increase aerobic power, which is reflected by an increase in anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity. Therefore, workloads that used to be a post-anaerobic threshold workload and thus fatiguing may now be a pre-anaerobic threshold workload and non-fatiguing. Again, even if you are doing sprint interval training, no matter how many people describe it as anaerobic training, there is no such thing as anaerobic fitness. So later on, we will discuss this myth a bit further and discuss how even sprint interval training can be a great mode of training to improve aerobic power. Now, to better understand the practical implications of improved aerobic power, I want to present some experimental data here that I collected on elite marathoners and also recreationally active individuals, the quote-unquote average Joe, if you will. Now, the test we had both of these groups undergo was a 13.1 mile per hour run to failure treadmill test, and this test involved just what the description implies. We had subjects in both groups run at a constant speed of 13.1 miles per hour on a treadmill, and we simply tested how long they could sustain that workload for. A few days before this test, we also tested the subject's anaerobic threshold as well as VO2 max. The anaerobic threshold was measured via ventilatory threshold testing, and VO2 max was tested to quantify the aerobic capacity. So why 13.1 miles per hour? Well, this is an important test for marathoners because a 13.1 miles per hour average run pace equates to a sub 2 hour race time, which is the ultimate goal for competitive marathoners. So we wanted to see how long the elite marathoners can sustain a 13.1 mile per hour workload and compare that to the average Joe. Now, I'm sure you can imagine how fast a 13.1 mile per hour run is on a treadmill. It's pretty fast. To some of us, 13.1 miles per hour is an all-out sprint speed. So let's take a look at the results. So first, let's look at how long the subjects that were average Joes could sustain this 13.1 mile per hour run. So subject 1 was able to sustain that 13.1 mile per hour run for 1 minute and 30 seconds. Subject 2, 54 seconds. Subject 3, 1 minute and 12 seconds. Subject 4, only 25 seconds. Subject 5, 1 minute and 20 seconds. And on average, the average Joes was able to sustain that 13.1 mile per hour run for only 1 minute and 4 seconds. Now let's take a look at the elite marathoners and see how long each subject was able to sustain a 13.1 mile per hour running workload. Subject 1 was able to sustain that 13.1 mile per hour running workload for 1 hour, 57 minutes, and 32 seconds. Subject 2, 1 hour, 42 minutes, and 10 seconds. Subject 3, 2 hours, 2 minutes, and 14 seconds. Subject 4, 1 hour, 58 minutes, and 16 seconds. Subject 5, 2 hours, 1 minute, and 18 seconds for an average of 1 hour, 56 minutes, and 18 seconds. So just imagine that, running 13.1 miles per hour on a treadmill and being able to do that for almost 2 hours straight. So as you can clearly see, the elite marathoners did not experience acute muscular fatigue running at 13.1 miles per hour, while the average Joes clearly did. The only reason these marathoners stopped was not because of fatigue after 2 hours of running, but because of exhaustion, which we defined in part 1 as simply running out of fuel. More specifically, their muscle glycogen was completely depleted. Now, remember, muscular endurance is about not only achieving a higher workload, but sustaining that workload. So yes, the average Joe can achieve 13.1 miles per hour, but can they sustain it? No, they cannot. This data also demonstrates that simply achieving 13.1 miles per hour is possible for many, but sustaining 13.1 miles per hour without fatigue is a whole nother story, right? Achieving and sustaining such a high workload is exemplary of muscular endurance. So the important question is why? Why is the elite marathoner able to maintain a 13.1 miles per hour workload for a significantly longer time than the average Joe? The obvious answer is that the average Joe during the 13.1 miles per hour run experienced acute muscular fatigue, while the elite marathoner did not. But what explains this from a physiological perspective? Let's take a look at the measures of aerobic power from the other exercise lab tests and compare between groups. First, the average Joe. Let's take a look at their VO2 max, which again is maximum oxygen consumption rate and is a quantification of aerobic capacity, which is the maximum ATP producing capacity of the aerobic system. So for the average Joes, subject 1 had a VO2 max of 60 milliliters per kilogram of body weight per minute. Subject 2 had a VO2 max of 54. Subject 3 with the VO2 max of 58. Subject 4 with the VO2 max of 42. And 58 for subject 5, with the average VO2 max for the average Joe group being 54 milliliters per kilogram of body weight per minute. Now, in all honesty, compared to norm values, these numbers are not terrible. They are somewhat average for the general population within their age range. Now, here's what's important. Let's look at the intensity at which the anaerobic threshold is observed. The intensity is reflected as a percent of VO2 max. So this is relative intensity relative to the VO2 max. So for subject 1, their anaerobic threshold was at a relative intensity of 60% VO2 max, 58% VO2 max for subject 2, 62% of VO2 max for subject 3, 50% of VO2 max for subject 4, 58% VO2 max for subject 5, and the average anaerobic threshold for the average Joes was 58% VO2 max intensity. Now, during the 13.1 miles per hour run, we hooked up the subjects to a metabolic cart and we measured their oxygen consumption rate, their VO2. And we calculated the intensity of that 13.1 mile per hour run relative to their VO2 max, so as a percentage of their VO2 max. So for subject 1, the 13.1 mile per hour run was a relative intensity of 80% of their VO2 max. So was that 13.1 mile per hour run for subject 1 a workload above or below their anaerobic threshold? Well, that 13.1 mile per hour run for subject 1 was an intensity of 80% VO2 max, and their anaerobic threshold was at an intensity of 60% VO2 max. So yes, that 13.1 mile per hour run was significantly above subject 1's anaerobic threshold. So this means subject 1 was under a hypoxic stress and the active muscles were undergoing acute metabolic acidosis from proton accumulation as well as inorganic phosphate accumulation. Thus, muscle contractions were self-inhibited during this 13.1 mile per hour run. In other words, the hypoxic metabolic stress of the 13.1 mile per hour workload induced fatigue to slow the muscles down, to reduce the ATP and oxygen demand of the muscle to get down to a pre-anaerobic threshold workload. And this all occurred within 1 minute and 30 seconds. Fatigue forced the subject to stop at 1 minute and 30 seconds. So in summary, subject 1 was only able to sustain the 13.1 mile per hour workload for 1 minute and 30 seconds because that workload was at a relative intensity above their anaerobic threshold. And you should be confident in understanding that the fatigue subject 1 experienced was in response to that hypoxic stress. Now let's look at subject number 2, same story as subject 1. The 13.1 mile per hour run workload was at a relative intensity of 82% of their VO2 max, which is higher than the intensity at which their anaerobic threshold was observed, which was 58% of their VO2 max. This means subject 2 was way above their anaerobic threshold during that 13.1 mile per hour run. Thus, conceivably, subject 2 may have experienced greater hypoxic stress and thus fatigue compared to subject 1. And that is reflected in subject 2's performance. Subject 2 was only able to sustain that run for 54 seconds. Now, if you look at subjects 3, 4, and 5, we have the same situation. If you look at subject 4 in particular, you can see that he performed the worst out of the group. He could only sustain that 13.1 mile per hour run workload for only 25 seconds. Now, let's look at the relative intensity of that 13.1 mile per hour run for this subject. It was 90% of his VO2 max, which means that the 13.1 mile per hour workload is near maximum intensity for this subject. And what was the intensity of his anaerobic threshold? It was pretty low at 50% of his VO2 max. So subject 4 was way above his anaerobic threshold during that 13.1 mile per hour test. And thus the hypoxic stress was comparatively more severe in subject 4. And thus, fatigue was comparatively more severe in subject 4 compared to the others. And this was reflected by a very poor performance. Okay, now let's take a look at the elite marathoners. We obviously know that they were able to sustain that 13.1 mile per hour run for significantly longer, for almost 2 hours. And I think you all can guess by now that the 13.1 mile per hour workload was at an intensity below their anaerobic threshold. So let's take a look at their testing data. Of course, as you can expect, their VO2 max, which again is a measure of aerobic capacity, was significantly greater than the average Joes. On average, the VO2 max for the elite marathoner group was 81 milliliters per kilogram of body weight per minute, which is again significantly greater than the 54 average for the average Joes. But as we know, VO2 max is only one factor of aerobic power, meaning it's not the only important factor for endurance performance. Let's take a look at the elite marathoners' anaerobic threshold, again as reflected by a percentage of their VO2 max. Subject 1 had an anaerobic threshold intensity of 78% of their VO2 max. Subject 2 had an anaerobic threshold of 80% of their VO2 max. Subject 3, 79% VO2 max. Subject 4, 87% of their VO2 max. Subject 5, 84% of their VO2 max. And on average, for the elite marathoners, anaerobic threshold was 82% of VO2 max. You can clearly see that the elite marathoners had a significantly greater anaerobic threshold intensity compared to the average Joe. You could say that since VO2 max, aerobic capacity, as well as anaerobic threshold, was significantly greater in the elite marathoners versus average Joes, you can say that the elite marathoners altogether had greater aerobic power. But what's more important here is the relative intensity of that 13.1 mile per hour run for the elite marathoners. So let's first take a look at subject number 1. The 13.1 mile per hour run was a relative intensity of 75% VO2 max. So was this intensity post or pre-anaerobic threshold? It was pre-anaerobic threshold. The intensity of the 13.1 mile per hour run was lower than the intensity at which the anaerobic threshold was observed. Therefore, subject 1 did not experience hypoxic stress in their muscles during that 13.1 mile per hour run. Therefore, subject 1 did not experience acute metabolic acidosis or inorganic phosphate accumulation, and thus there was no stimulus or reason for fatigue. Again, because there was no stress. If you look at subjects 2, 3, 4, and 5, we have the same exact situation. The intensity of their 13.1 mile per hour run was slightly less than their individual anaerobic threshold intensity. Subject 2, that 13.1 mile per hour run was a relative intensity of 78%. Their anaerobic threshold intensity was 80%. So at 13.1 miles per hour, they were slightly below their anaerobic threshold. Same thing with subject 3, 4, and 5. And on average, the 13.1 mile per hour run for the elite marathoners was a relative intensity of 78% VO2 max. And the average anaerobic threshold intensity was 82% VO2 max. So that 13.1 mile per hour run was a pre-anaerobic threshold non-hypoxic exercise workload or intensity. And again, this is why the elite marathoners were able to sustain that running workload for almost 2 hours straight. They did not experience acute muscular fatigue. So from this data, you can clearly see the importance of aerobic power in endurance performance, which again is being able to achieve and sustain greater muscular work. And just as a reminder, aerobic power is a function of both VO2 max and anaerobic threshold. Now, as I alluded to earlier for the elite marathoner, VO2 max at this level of competition and training is not the most important factor, because for these individuals, due to their extensive training history, they have achieved the highest possible VO2 max that they can ever achieve, meaning they've achieved the highest possible aerobic capacity that they can ever achieve. And this is genetically determined. As you can see, their VO2 max scores are very high compared to norm values. So for very well-trained individuals such as these elite marathoners, the goal outcome of their training is yes, to improve aerobic power, but more specifically through anaerobic threshold improvements. They want to get that anaerobic threshold intensity as close to 100% VO2 max as possible. Now keep in mind, there's never a case where anaerobic threshold intensity is at VO2 max. I believe the record for anaerobic threshold was somewhere around 90% VO2 max. 82% VO2 max is pretty high, and this is why they are elite marathoners. So to put it all into a visual perspective, let's compare the aerobic anaerobic curves of the average Joes versus the elite marathoners. So on the x-axis, you have running speed as a measure of exercise workload, and that 13.1 mile per hour run is placed here on the x-axis on both figures, exactly in the same spot. So as you can see with the average Joe, their aerobic power is significantly lower than the elite marathoners. More importantly, if you look at the 13.1 mile per hour workload for the average Joe, you can clearly see that it is at an intensity above their anaerobic threshold, which means that the 13.1 mile per hour workload is a post-anaerobic threshold workload, and thus it is fatiguing as demonstrated by the data in the previous slide. For the elite marathoner, you can see that the 13.1 mile per hour workload is slightly below their anaerobic threshold, which means it is a pre-anaerobic threshold workload and thus non-fatiguing. So obviously the elite marathoner will be able to not only achieve 13.1 mile per hour, but sustain it for a prolonged duration until they experience exhaustion, until they run out of fuel, in other words. And the thing is, this 13.1 miles per hour is right below their anaerobic threshold. And that is the point for marathon performance, right? They want to run at a pace right before their anaerobic threshold intensity, because that is the maximum workload that they can sustain without experiencing fatigue. This is also referred to as your maximum steady state workload. It's the maximum workload that you can sustain without fatigue. Maximum steady state workload. So for these elite marathoners during that test, that 13.1 miles per hour, since it was slightly below the intensity of their anaerobic threshold, you could say that 13.1 miles per hour is their maximum steady state workload. Now, you could also perceive this comparison between the average Joe and elite marathoner as a comparison within a single individual from pre to post training. So say you were an average Joe at one point and then you trained for however many months and you became a competitive marathoner. So view the left side as your pre-training curves and the right side as your post-training curves. The difference between these two figures reflect the changes you could expect with training. So to reiterate, with proper training, the 13.1 mile per hour run can become quote unquote easier and perhaps less fatiguing or even non-fatiguing because of an improvement in aerobic power, which again is a function of anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity. Now, as a recap question, if improvements in aerobic power is critical to experience improvements in endurance and fatigue resistance, which of the following measurements must improve? The answers would be lactate or ventilatory thresholds, which are measures of anaerobic threshold, and VO2 max, which is a measure of aerobic capacity. And as a side question, which of the following measures of aerobic power would an elite marathoner expect to improve with training? It would be the measures of anaerobic threshold, which again include lactate or ventilatory thresholds, because again, their VO2 max has likely already reached its peak. So let's talk a little bit more about aerobic power. Again, aerobic power is a function of aerobic capacity as well as anaerobic threshold, and thus a function of VO2 max and lactate or ventilatory thresholds respectively. As I emphasized moments earlier, anaerobic threshold becomes more and more the critical physiological measure of aerobic power as you become more well-trained. And this is because there is a genetically determined ceiling for how much your VO2 max can increase, and therefore how much your aerobic capacity can increase. So as demonstrated in the content in the previous slides, the key to improving performance or endurance, in other words, is to be able to stay below the anaerobic threshold with higher workloads, so that you can achieve these higher workloads and also sustain them for a longer duration due to the absence of metabolic stress and thus fatigue. This concept is reiterated in bullets 4 and 5. And again, to address the fundamental aspect of endurance training or conditioning programs, in order for one's anaerobic threshold to improve and thus aerobic power to improve, the training intensity must elicit the appropriate stress, which again is that hypoxic/metabolic stress during post-anaerobic threshold exercise. This means that during your training, there needs to be frequent, high-volume post-anaerobic threshold exercise bouts so that your muscles are frequently exposed to this metabolic hypoxic stressor. Now, because of the frequent stress imposed on the muscles, there is a reason or stimulus for your muscles to undergo adaptation. And those adaptations are again collectively termed aerobic adaptations, which makes a given workload that was once post-anaerobic threshold and hypoxic into one that is pre-anaerobic threshold and non-hypoxic. This is achieved through an improvement in aerobic power, which includes an improvement in the anaerobic threshold intensity. Now, you can think of the anaerobic threshold as the red line on a tachometer. If a car engine is pushed past the red line, the engine will undergo a lot of stress. Now imagine over time, as you keep running that engine past this red line day in and day out, the engine starts to get stronger and stronger, and it adapts to the stress frequently imposed on it. And that red line eventually increases from 7,000 RPMs as shown here to say 8,000 RPMs. This means you can now run your car engine past 7,000 RPMs and up to 8,000 RPMs without any stress. This analogy illustrates the concept of endurance training or conditioning. The anaerobic threshold is your muscle's red line, and if you exercise at a workload or intensity past this red line, there is a hypoxic stress, and that intensity or workload is fatiguing. Now, as you continue to train at intensities at or above your red line, imposing frequent stress to your muscles will eventually adapt and increase your red line so that you can do more work without stress and thus fatigue. So if I ask the question, which of the following is required for a training program for one to experience an increase in aerobic power, which includes anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity, the answer would be frequent exposures to hypoxic stress. Other potential answer choices that would essentially say the same thing would be anaerobic threshold to post-anaerobic threshold exercise bouts or fatiguing exercise bouts. So by now, you should be very clear that any improvements in endurance performance and fatigue resistance is due to solely aerobic adaptations, which improves aerobic power. So even if you're doing so-called anaerobic training, quote unquote, which people often describe training like high intensity to sprint interval training, improvements in endurance and fatigue resistance is again due to aerobic adaptations and improved aerobic power or fitness. So to bust some common myths out there that even strength and conditioning professionals disseminate, there is never a situation in which the anaerobic system is isolated as depicted in the figure to the left. There is no situation in which the anaerobic system can, quote unquote, improve to enhance performance. The changes from left to right is what many people believe contributes to increased performance with, quote unquote, anaerobic training, with training highly above the anaerobic threshold, in other words. This type of change does not happen because this is not how aerobic and anaerobic systems function. There is no such thing as anaerobic fitness or enhancement in anaerobic metabolism. As shown in the bottom left figure on slide 4, if you are more reliant on anaerobic metabolism to meet your ATP needs, then that means you are out of shape. That means your aerobic system, your primary bioenergetic system, is not powerful enough to meet ATP demands at higher workloads. So the correct perspective of the adaptations that occur in response to your so-called quote-unquote anaerobic training is reflected here as shown in the previous slides as well. Again, many people consider exercise post-anaerobic threshold as quote-unquote anaerobic exercise, but as you can see, it is very, very aerobic. Only a portion of the ATP demand is fulfilled anaerobically. Anaerobic systems, again, only support the aerobic system when the aerobic system does not have enough oxygen or power to meet the full ATP demand. So yes, even when you do max intensity exercise training and sprint interval training or CrossFit or max effort circuit training, the improvements in endurance performance and fatigue resistance is again due solely to improvements in aerobic power as shown here from left to right. So if you do sprint interval training and you notice that you are more fit and able to do more work without fatigue, do not attribute it to quote unquote anaerobic fitness or anaerobic adaptations. It is due to aerobic adaptations, which improve aerobic power, which include an improvement in anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity. So is there any research data and evidence that is currently published that supports this? Yes, in fact, there is. There is a lot of evidence, and this figure here summarizes results of numerous studies that have tested the effects of maximum effort sprint interval training programs on aerobic power, more specifically on aerobic capacity, as measured by VO2 max. So if the myth, as presented 2 slides back, was factual, then sprint interval training would not have any impact on aerobic variables like VO2 max. But what does all the research studies show? Now, these are the results of 38 trials across 34 studies which examine the effects of sprint interval training on aerobic capacity or VO2 max. The red bars represent sprint interval training programs that included 20 to 30-second sprints with 2 to 3 sprint repetitions. The gray bars represent sprint interval training programs that consisted of 10 to 30-second sprints with 4 to 6 sprint repetitions. And the white bars represent sprint interval training programs that consisted of 10 to 30-second sprints with more than 6 sprint repetitions. And what does each study demonstrate? Well, each study showed that sprint interval training improved aerobic capacity and thus improved aerobic power, which indicates that sprint interval training induces aerobic adaptations. The analysis of all these studies show that the greatest improvements in VO2 max or aerobic capacity resulted from longer sprints with low volume or repetitions. However, only a few studies tested this type of sprint interval training program. Most studies, as you can see by the number of gray bars, were done on 10 to 30-second sprints for 4 to 6 sprint repetitions. So although longer sprints of lower repetitions show the greatest improvement in anaerobic capacity, the strength of evidence was greatest with moderate repetitions of 10 to 30-second sprints. So if I ask the question, which of the following sprint interval training programs have the greatest strength of evidence in terms of its effects on improving aerobic capacity, the answer would be 10 to 30-second sprints with moderate repetitions, such as 4 to 6 sprint repetitions. However, overall, generally speaking, across all these studies, we can clearly see that low volume training using maximum intensity exercise can be an effective method to elicit aerobic adaptations and thus improvements in aerobic power and thus endurance performance, being able to achieve and sustain greater muscular work due to the mitigation of stress and thus fatigue. Now, there is even a growing body of evidence that demonstrates these types of effects on aerobic capacity with high-intensity resistance training, such as CrossFit, for example. Now, from a practical perspective, this may be of benefit for many people as it is a time-efficient way to improve aerobic fitness. Now, going back to the fundamentals, why would sprint interval training elicit aerobic adaptations to improve aerobic power? It is because sprinting is maximum intensity and thus as far above the anaerobic threshold as possible. And thus, sprint interval training involves repeated exposures to the most hypoxic stress in the muscles that are involved in sprinting. Remember, stress equals adaptation. So sprint interval training, more specifically sprinting, would ensure that your muscles are under the appropriate stress to cause adaptation and improvements. Now, here's the thing, because sprinting is so fatiguing, repetitions are very short in duration. And this is why you need to do multiple intervals of sprints to expose the muscle to the hypoxic stress sufficiently to induce adaptations. For someone who is very untrained, you could expect improvements in aerobic power even with doing one all-out sprint per day. But as you become better trained, we all know that training must be progressive and thus modifications must be made, such as increasing the volume or reps of each sprint interval training bout. Now, if you're wondering how long the rest intervals were between each sprint repetition, it was roughly about 5 minutes, and it was active rest. So they were just doing pre-anaerobic threshold light exercise in between each sprint.